Edwin Canistracci here, and I'm here to do part 2 of the new wave of British heavy metal. This is a series of videos I'm going to do discussing this really awesome period and very short-lived period in heavy metal history from the late 70s into the very early 80s. And my last video I did was Def Leppard, the early years. So if you didn't check that one out, check it out. Now I'm talking about the group most associated with the new wave of British heavy metal, the one and only Iron Maiden. Yep, Iron Maiden. And I'm drinking my favorite scotch. Told you I got a new bottle of it, double black. There you go. Already been drinking that a little bit. So, but don't worry, I can steer this ship the way I gotta. So we're gonna talk about Iron Maiden and just focus on the early years with Paul Di'Anno. Now, I'm not your typical Iron Maiden fan. I'm going to say this right out there. I know there's a lot of Maiden fans out there who might not like what I'm about to say. I'm a bigger fan of the Paul Di'Anno stuff than Bruce Dickinson. So it's right there. That might be controversial to some people because most people associate Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson. His albums are the albums that are the most popular for the most part. Although there is a hardcore group, a small group, but pretty hardcore group of fervent Iron Maiden fans that do love the Di'Anno years. And of course, there's many that love both. And don't get me wrong, I do really like the Bruce Dickinson stuff too. And in fact, the first 3 albums with Bruce Dickinson I think are great. In fact, the first 5 Iron Maiden albums, man, you can't lose with them. They're all great albums. And actually, for a period when I was younger, I'd say Power Slave was almost consistently my favorite Maiden album. So there you go. And it's still definitely my favorite with Bruce Dickinson singing. Over the years, I find myself just going back again and again to his first 2 albums with Di'Anno. Something about it, it's just he's just more straight up. I'm going to get into that more after I just explain a little bit about the history of the band and my relationship with them. I got into them in, I believe it's 1990, the early 90s with No Prayer for the Dying. I was, of course, already aware of Maiden from watching them clips on like Headbangers Ball and stuff, and I knew like Number of the Beast and The Trooper and Run to the Hills and a few of the hits, and they were on my radar. It's like, oh, this seems like a cool band, from the 80s. But it was like No Prayer for the Dying was the first time I went out and actually bought an Iron Maiden album. And I became, I would say, a casual fan based off that album. And I'm going to talk about that album again at the very end. But I was never a hardcore Maiden fan. I became a more of a casual fan here and there. But then I would say it was like in the early O's, along with a bunch of remasters for Motorhead and Judas Priest. And this is when I explained this in the last video, this is when I really got into the new wave of British heavy metal. And along with that, that's when I started to reappraise Maiden and really dived into their discography in a big way. And now, I have all their albums. And even though I don't think their later albums are so hot, they lean a little bit too much on the prog side. For my taste, the song's a little too long, and they don't have the same rock and street quality that their earlier stuff does. They're definitely a little more prog, and I prefer them when they're a little more heavy metal. But that being said, I always have respect for Iron Maiden, and I always get their albums when a new album comes out. So even if I don't think it's that hot, I always give it a chance. And, over the years, I think they've been hit and miss. I've liked some of their albums, definitely better than others, but I always have respect for them. But with Maiden, it's really, for the most part, about the first 5 albums with me. It's not like Priest, where I'm a big fan of their whole discography. And that's also another debate. I know a lot of metal heads, it's like Priest or Maiden, Priest or Maiden. Well, I'm definitely in the Priest, side of things. I'm definitely more of a Priest fan. But doesn't mean you can't be, fans of both. And let me tell you something. If Paul Di'Anno stayed in the band, if that was even possible. I don't know. I mean, he was doing a lot of cocaine, but they give Priest a run for the money, in my opinion. Actually, I think their first 2 albums definitely go head to head with what Priest were putting out at that time period, which is some of Priest's best stuff, in the early '80s. But I think Maiden with Paul Di'Anno was a ferocious beast, and to me was on par with Priest at their best, and early Metallica and Black Sabbath, both the Ozzy and the Dio years. I think that they were really on that level. And they kind of evolved into a different kind of band over the years, Bruce Dickinson, which, again, if you're more into the prog stuff, you might appreciate. But me, they got farther away from being that straight up from the street, badass, heavy metal band that they were when Paul Di'Anno was in the group. Well, that all aside, now let's talk about the band themselves. Formed by Steve Harris, bassist Steve Harris, and although he doesn't sing like Lemmy, the fact that the founding member and the man who writes most of their songs is a bassist, like Motorhead, it gives them a certain quality, which also I used to play bass, so I tend to like bands that have, especially heavy metal bands, where bass isn't always so prominent, but some bands like Motorhead, like Overkill, bands where the bassist is writing most of the songs, there's, sure enough, the bass gets mixed up in the mix, gets put up in the mix a little bit more than you would hear in a lot of other heavy metal bands. And I like it. And I think it's something that gives Iron Maiden a very distinct sound. In fact, Steve Harris's bass playing, especially on those early albums, it's some of the best musicianship you'll ever hear on a record. And he's like doing all this like really cool stuff, and it's a driving force. I would say that's, even though the dual guitar work, which I say is said on that last video I made, is a characteristic of a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, taking a bit from Thin Lizzy and also the band UFO, which I know was a big influence on Steve Harris, like a song like Doctor Doctor. You can hear that kind of guitar style throughout Maiden's career, especially in those early albums. But I still think if I would zero in on a driving thing that's really the sound of Maiden, I'd say it's Steve Harris's bass, the gallop bass. And that's not easy to do. And he would do it with 3 fingers. It was like magical stuff. And man, this guy, and he had great charisma and stage presence. And as a headbanging bassist, even though I was more of just a casual Maiden fan, I always appreciated Steve Harris as a bassist and thought it was cool that the bassist was, the driving creative force in the band. And they formed the band like in the mid-70s. I believe it was 76. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I think it's 76. But it was mid-70s, and there was a lot of different lineups. Steve Harris had a lot of different versions of Maiden. There was even an early one that had like a keyboardist, and probably going more for a UFO type of sound in the mid-70s. I think, I'm pretty sure Dave Murray was in fairly early. I don't think, like this thing, some people go, well, is a founding member or if we're talking about an original lineup, I've seen this debate sometimes. People say, is that like the band that first formed, or do we count from the first album? I'm a kind of first album guy. To me, that's, unless a band member was in the band for years and contributed to their sound, their signature sound in a major way, with the exception of that, I'd go with the first album, because bands go through, especially in their early days, they go through so many different lineups before they really find their sound, and they might have just some dude that played guitar for a week before he got some better job at the hardware store, and does that guy get to claim that he's a founding or original member? I mean, I guess technically, but in terms of reality, to me, it's the band that comes together that really kind of forms the sound, and or it's the band that's like the first lineup on the first album, so, which is always just an easy way to go by. But Iron Maiden, yeah, they had a lot of guys. I don't know the names of every guy that Steve Harris played with for like 5 years before they got their first album. It's a lot of guys. But I know Dave Murray got in there early on. And Steve Harris and Dave Murray are the only 2 members of the band that have been on every Iron Maiden album, every officially released Iron Maiden album. They're the only 2 guys. I think around the late 70s, by 79, they did have Paul Di'Anno. He came in as their singer. He wasn't the first singer. There was, I think, 1 or 2 other guys before him. But Paul Di'Anno came in, and he was the guy that became their first, I would say, official Iron Maiden singer. Because I'm talking official in the sense that he's the guy on the first album, and he's the guy on their demo that got them signed. But man, let me just go. I can't say enough good things about Paul Di'Anno. He was a flame that burned out quickly, but shined very brightly for a brief period. And he's still alive, and he's always been a cool guy doing cool rock and metal music over the years. But really, I do have to say, I feel his potential for what he could have been was never entirely fulfilled. But man, for those first two albums, to me, let's say Paul Di'Anno. Yeah, some people say Bruce Dickinson, he has more range. But, it's like you could say that about Dio versus Ozzy. Now, I love Dio. Nothing against Dio. And I think he's an awesome singer. One of the greatest heavy metal singers ever. And I love the stuff he did, not just in Sabbath, for Mob Rules and Heaven and Hell. But I also love the Rainbow stuff and the Dio band and all that stuff. It's great. It's great stuff. But that being said, there's just something about Ozzy and Sabbath that there's a quality to it. Yes, Ronnie has far more range than Ozzy as a singer. There's no question about it. Technically, Ronnie James Dio is a better singer. But Ozzy's Ozzy, you know what I mean? Like, he just has this quality, and it's very unique. It's very authentic, and it's very raw. And Ozzy, especially on those early Sabbath albums, he just sounds like a geezer from the factory coming in and singing a song. This messed up young man that like society has forgotten. And he's kind of singing for all the blokes. And he's very relatable. That's the thing about Ozzy. Like, Ronnie's great, but it's kind of like a show. Like, he's an entertainer, He's putting on the show that he's like the magical wizard guy slaying dragons on the rainbow. And it's cool and it's fun, but you can't really relate to that, And Ozzy, it's just like Ozzy is there singing about like the street and evil stuff. And it's just more relatable. And I would also say singers like Steven Tyler, Bon Scott, and Brian Johnson, both AC/DC had two singers like this, two working class guys that were very relatable. And Paul Di'Anno was a singer like that, whereas I'd say Bruce Dickinson is more in the Ronnie James Dio category. He's got a lot of range. He's a cool singer. He's got a cool voice. But even in terms of the subject matter of the band and his approach, it's like a show. It's like he's a showman singing about historical events and old poems and old novels and old movies and stuff. And it's really cool. But there's something, when you hear Paul Di'Anno, you feel like you're hearing a guy from the streets. You feel like you're hearing a guy who works for a living and is then singing with the band. There's just something very relatable about him. And that's one of the many reasons I love this period of our Iron Maiden with Paul Di'Anno. I feel they're more grounded, they're more street, both musically but also vocally with Paul Di'Anno. He just really grounds the band in a way that once he's gone, it becomes something else. And it's still cool, but it's not that same thing that I connect with. And so I really connect to Paul Di'Anno. And just look at this guy. He's just a cool guy. He's just a bad mofo. He's just a cool, not trying too hard kind of guy. And there's a question too whether Iron Maiden were influenced by punk in this period. Now, Steve Harris, he hates punk, and he goes out of his way to always say in interviews, like, no, punk rock had no influence on Iron Maiden whatsoever. He's like, definitive, not what, it was like UFO, it was Thin Lizzy, it was, classic rock. We were not into punk. He might say that now, and maybe personally he didn't like punk, but, I listened to those first two albums, especially the first one, and I hear some punk influence, and it's one of the things that makes the new wave of British heavy metal, is that there's this punk influence, and the speed, the energy, the roughness, and I'd say Paul Di'Anno. I mean, look, the guy didn't even have long hair. He had kind of a shaggy haircut, but he wasn't like I wouldn't say, it wasn't really a punk haircut either, but, he was like some kind of hybrid. Paul Di'Anno was like some hybrid between a punk singer and a metal singer. I mean, look at him. I mean, he's a geezer that could kind of roll with punks or headbangers. And I feel like they utilized that in the late 70s and early 80s when that was still fashionable. And I feel by 82, when heavy metal definitely was proven to be the winner and punk was already kind of faded out of the scene, I feel it's not entirely unlike what a lot of bands did in the 90s, where they got rid of their more 80s type singers, and replaced them with more Chris Cornell type singing, guys, or guys with dark hair instead of blonde hair, going more for the 90s sing. I feel to a degree they wanted to replace Paul Di'Anno, despite what they say, and despite Paul's problems, and despite his drug use, and all the issues that I'm sure were a contributing factor. I also think that they wanted a more early 80s Dio type sounding singer because things were kind of moving in that direction and away from the punk thing. And I feel like Di'Anno represented more of kind of a late 70s punk aesthetic that Steve Harris was no longer interested in exploiting. And maybe because it wasn't where he was musically at. I mean, it obviously wasn't where he was musically at and where he wanted to go. But I'm just saying, I think Paul Di'Anno, served kind of his purpose for the band. And then when they wanted to get to the next level, they decided they wanted a different kind of singer. But that's just a theory of mine. It's not, Tell me if you agree with me or don't. Anyway, I love this guy. He's great. He's by the way, Paul Di'Anno. Some people wonder, like, is he Italian? Is he what? Was it? From what I gather, his father's Brazilian. So his father's from Brazil and his mother's Italian. So he's not just a hybrid of a punk and a metal guy. He's a hybrid between a Brazilian and a Italian. Anyway, he's a cool guy. He's awesome. I love Paul Di'Anno. And I think he's also an underrated singer. He's a better singer than people give him credit for. He does these cool, like, David Lee Roth type yelps, like, or whatever you call the little high pitched screams. Ah! I can't do it, but you know what I mean. He does that, and he kind of comes in with this high pitched thing just when you need it, as a little, like it's a little punctuation, and we'll get to kind of songs he does that. Obviously, there are songs that Bruce Dickinson could sing that Paul Di'Anno couldn't pull off, but there's also some songs that I think Paul Di'Anno does that I don't think Bruce Dickinson could pull off. Just because he's a different kind of singer, and just because his range has got a kind of a different focus, doesn't mean that he's a lesser singer. Steve Harris, he puts together this band. He finally gets a lineup that's kind of stable. With Paul Di'Anno singing, Dave Murray. They always wanted Dave Murray's friend, Adrian Smith, to be the guitarist, but he was in another band. So at the time, and I think he was contractually obligated, so he couldn't be in it. So they grabbed a different guy. They did a demo called they call it the Soundhouse tapes. There's a club in London during the late 70s and early 80s called the Bandwagon Heavy Metal Soundhouse. Sounds like a cool place, doesn't it? The Bandwagon Heavy Metal Soundhouse. And this club, I've seen clips of this in documentaries about the new wave British heavy metal. It looked really cool. All these geezers and blokes were in there, and they were all like air guitaring and headbanging and stuff, and they had cool denim jackets and leather jackets on, and studs and Motorhead and AC/DC patches, and it looked like a cool scene. They had a DJ, and they actually, they just played underground heavy metal music, and Steve Harris slipped this demo that they recorded, which only had 3 songs. I know the song Iron Maiden, it was one of them. I think Prowler and Invader. Not Invaders, but just the song Invader, which was a different track, which later I think became a B-side on Women in Uniform. Anyway, so they gave this demo, and it's like it's good. I've heard it. It's rough. It's definitely got their signature sound right out of the gate with the dual guitars and that great riff on Iron Maiden. It's a little slower. Paul Di'Anno sounding great right out of the gate, and they got their sound. It's like a rough version. It's available on YouTube. You can listen to it, and that demo became a sensation in the Soundhouse Club, and it became like the #1 requested record played and or a cassette, however they played it there. And that got the attention of not just Sounds Magazine, which I talked about in the last video I did, which was a big champion in new wave of British heavy metal, and they ranked it as like the #1 new album, new band out there is like Iron Maiden because of this demo. And the demo they put out as like a EP. And it sold really well. There was only a few copies out there, and now they're collector's items, of course, but it sold really well, and everyone was so excited. There's no doubt about it. Iron Maiden was the hottest underground metal band, and they were definitely the leaders of the new wave of British heavy metal. They were the band to look out for, and they got a major label, EMI, got them, and they got in the studio, and they did their first album, 1980, Iron Maiden. And the guitars, it's Dave Murray, like I said, and Dennis Stratton is the guitarist on this first album. They don't have Adrian Smith yet. It's Dennis Stratton, but he does a very good job. He does good. The guitars are great on this. And the drummer, Clive Burr. Oh, man, I love Clive Burr. They had a few other drummers before he came in. And I believe he came in. Yeah, he's not on the Soundhouse demo. The Soundhouse demo is some guy named Doug Sampson. Doug Sampson's the drummer on that. So it's after that, but before the new album, before the 1980 debut album, Clive came in, and man, Clive is amazing. The best Iron Maiden drummer, in my opinion. Another reason why I love the early Maiden the best, not just because of Paul Di'Anno, but also because of the drummer. Because Clive, man, this guy could play, and it's such a groove, and it's just also, along with Paul Di'Anno, I feel Clive gave them a street edge through his drumming. It's really fast and furious, and just he had a great feel in the drums. And this first album's great. It's grown a lot on me over the years. There was even a period where it was my favorite Iron Maiden album. Not anymore. It's my second favorite, a very close second. But this album is great. It comes out of the gate. I want to make sure I get the track listing all right. Prowler's the first song, I know that, which comes with the guitars, and it's just this new sound. This is like, they really sound like a new form of heavy metal, which is why they're part of the new wave of British heavy metal. It's right out of the gate with this song. And in the original British version, the second song was Remember Tomorrow, which is a slower song, starts off slower and then gets heavy, which is kind of became a thing that Iron Maiden would do on a lot of their earlier albums, which I think the track listing could be a little bit better at times on some of the Maiden records. Because to me, your second song shouldn't be a song that starts slow. I think it's better like the way Metallica did it, where it's like the fourth song is that song, the one that's like a slow song, but then becomes heavy. But it's still a great song. I like Remember Tomorrow. I actually prefer the U.S. version. Actually, both these two albums, because the U.S. version, it's the same album, but they add a song. And in both cases, the song's awesome. So why wouldn't you prefer the version that has all the same songs, but an extra awesome song? And in this case, it definitely even helps the running order better, because it's one of their first singles, Sanctuary. And Sanctuary is a kick-in song. And that's a great second song. And on the U.S. version, that's the second song. And that's what you want to hear after the first, cool rocker. You want to hear a song that's even more rocking and faster, That's how I always like it. To me, it's like AC/DC. It's like, Hell's Bells goes into Shoot to Thrill. Or for those about to rock goes into Put the Finger on You. Like, I love when there's the first song that sets up. It's kind of a mid-tempo, cool song. And then the second song really takes charge. And to me, that's a perfect way to do a heavy metal album. And on the U.S. version of the debut, you got that with Sanctuary, which is a great song. And then it goes into Remember Tomorrow, which is, to me, works much better as a third song. And then you got their big anthem, Running Free, which was I believe, their first single. And yeah, it's a catchy song, really catchy. Surprised it wasn't even a bigger hit. Like, obviously a hit amongst metal fans. But to me, this song had like crossover appeal. It was really catchy, It's a real pumping your fist in the air kind of song, and real sing-along. Although it is very raw. The first album's very raw, so maybe that would be too much to people, because people are wimps and they don't like the raw stuff, but they should. And then after Running Free, you got Phantom of the Opera. Oh my God, Phantom of the Opera, masterpiece, one of the greatest Iron Maiden songs. And it definitely shows how they're evolving from the earlier demo and even from the other songs so far that we've heard. Like, you hear that this is kind of where Iron Maiden is going to be going. Like, they're going to be a street heavy metal band with a progressive side. Because this song is a little progressive, but not in a wanky way, in a really cool way. Kind of like early Rush. I really love the first 4 Rush albums. I love. Then I do like some of their other stuff, but to me they get a little too prog, kind of like Iron Maiden, and away from the harder rock and stuff. But when you got hard rock and stuff mixed with some prog stuff, like this song, hey, it's cool. I like it. And this stuff kind of foreshadows, you can see the influences had on thrash. And I know a very young Lars Ulrich, he had this album, and he was a very big fan of Iron Maiden. And of course, this was a big influence on Metallica and a lot of all those thrash bands. And then you got the instrumental Transylvania, which is cool. Strange World, which is a ballad, a straight up ballad. Doesn't get heavy like Remember Tomorrow, but it it has like a rocking guitar solo. But it's pretty much a straight up ballad. But this is kind of a typical kind of new wave British heavy metal ballad, where it's a ballad, but it's not. It still has a darkness to it. It's still kind of heavy, emotionally kind of heavy. I would say it's almost like the UK equivalent of like Leonard Skinner ballad, like Simple Man. Like, where it's a slow song, but there's kind of something dark and still kind of swaggering and rocking about it. And this song's kind of like that. And so it's about, but it's definitely not a wimpy song, and it's emotional and it's got some soul to it, and I really like it. And then you got Charlotte the Harlot, great song, really rocking. And then you got the title track and the band name Iron Maiden. I don't know. There was a lot of I remember in the '80s there was a lot of bands a lot of thrash bands did this, where there was like a song with their name. Anthrax had a song called Anthrax, and bands, or they would reference their name. Like Metallica actually references their name in like Whiplash. Like, so there's kind of a name checking thing. And Iron Maiden, I think they might have started that trend. Correct me well, I guess now Black Sabbath really started that trend. So I guess because Black Sabbath had Black Sabbath. So I guess Iron Maiden's doing that. But in the same way Black Sabbath was the originator of heavy metal, Iron Maiden's coming in as like waving the flag. Even though I do think Judas Priest and Motorhead created this, really created the sound and the aesthetic of the new wave British heavy metal. And Def Leppard's released a official EP actually before Iron Maiden. But I think Iron Maiden's definitely the band that really kicked the door down for the new wave British heavy metal. Riding in with Steve Harris's galloping bass. Even though he wasn't quite galloping quite yet, but in spirit he was. And it's an amazing album. Iron Maiden's just great, off the cuff, really street, and that's the thing I love about it. These guys from like they were an East London band, and you got Eddie, of course, is on the album cover. The illustrator, I believe, Derek Riggs, is that it? Yep, Derek Riggs is the illustrator, and he created Eddie, and he did all those classic Maiden illustration, all those great album covers throughout the 80s that you've seen as t-shirts and patches on the back of denim jackets. That guy, he's a gifted artist. And I personally, because Motorhead's my favorite band, Snaggletooth's my favorite. He's my favorite metal mascot. But objectively, I gotta admit, yeah, Eddie's the best. He's the best. There's no doubt about it that. And this is an era in the '80s. There are so many cool album covers. So many cool album covers. So there's a lot of competition. But I gotta give it to Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden did have the best album covers and the best single covers. They were just really, really cool. And like Twilight Zone. Look at that. Look at the single cover for the song, which was at first just a standalone single, Twilight Zone. Look at that cover. They're works of art. And Eddie was originally, they called him, he was not just the illustration on the first album cover. They had a big head on stage. Eventually, over the years, he would become more technologically advanced and be like a big mummy walking and all that stuff. It was a big part of the show. But in the early days, he was just like a big plastic or plaster head. I don't know what they made it out of, but it was really kind of junky looking and cool and raw. In a way, I think it looked kind of cooler that way. But they would call him because they had their working class like British accents, who they don't pronounce H. They had this thing against H, the letter H for some reason, and they instead of head, they say the Ed. They say, hey, look at the Ed. There's the Ed. And so out of that came Eddie. So it was Eddie the Ed. So that's forgive my bad British accent, but you get the point. You know what they do. They don't say H. I don't know why. Well, tell me in the comments section, British YouTubers, what's your deal with the letter H? Why don't you like it? It's there. Just say it. Or maybe don't say it, because if you didn't say it, he'd be Eddie, and that's a lame name. Eddie's much cooler. In fact, it's my name, Eddie. So there you go. Like it. Cool. Keep it. Keep being you, British people. Don't change. I don't want you to. Anyway, so the second album, 1981. Oh, here we go. Killers. Let me tell you something about Killers. It's my favorite Iron Maiden album. Favorite. like I said, when I was younger, it was Power Slave. Then there was a period where it was the first album, but consistently now for many years, it's kind of locked in there. I don't think it's ever going to change. It's Killers. Killers is a masterpiece. I think it's the greatest thing they ever did. And to me, it's the perfect Iron Maiden album for a couple of reasons. Now, even though he did a good job, Dennis Stratton did a good job, Adrian Smith, I do think, is a superior guitarist. And now he is in the band. He finally joins the band after they wanted him in the band. And Dave and Adrian, they just had this chemistry together. They do this dueling guitar thing, and it's just like in Priest. They just do it, and there's just this chemistry there, and the guitar playing is taken to another level. The musicianship overall is all taken to another level. Steve Harris's bass playing is on another level, and Clive's drums and the whole thing. And Paul Di'Anno, I think his singing is even better on this album. Everything's taken to the next level while still being very street and very tough and still very heavy metal. And I guess another important thing is the producer, Martin Birch. Is that how you say it? Martin Birch. Martin Birch is a really big. I was looking at this guy's credits before doing this video, and I was like really impressed. I knew he was Iron Maiden's producer, and he was like a big producer, but I wasn't aware of quite all the albums he did, and so many of them are classic metal albums that I loved and loved for years, and I didn't know it was all this one guy. Like he was an engineer for Deep Purple, and then he produced the Rainbow albums, all the ones with Dio, which are like God, Rainbow Rising. The production's so great on that. He did all that. He did he produced all the Whitesnake albums from the first one all the way to Slide It In. And those albums I really dig too, and I really like the production. And he did the two Sabbath albums with Dio in the early 80s, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. Wow. And in addition to that, he ends up producing every Iron Maiden album from Killers all the way to Fear of the Dark in the 90s. So wow, this guy's quite a producer. And man, you can hear it. Even though I do love the rawness of the first album, this guy does a great job. A little like Mutt Lange in the early 80s. And he's not quite as slick as he was, but in the sense that he knows how to make a band sound bigger and more mainstream while still keeping the hard edge. And I say Mutt Lange in the early 80s because that wasn't so much the case later on. The band sounds bigger now. They sound more like a professional, bigger, international band. But they still have the spirit, and they still have the energy, and they still have the aesthetic of the new wave British heavy metal. I still consider this the new wave British heavy metal, even though it's I would say it's the best produced new wave of British heavy metal album, easily. This is as good as a new wave British heavy metal album can be produced without no longer being the new wave British heavy metal. It's still raw, it's still street, but man, it's sonic perfection. And the tracks, man. You got the Itis. Is that how you pronounce it? Itis of March. Anyway, that's an instrumental. It starts off. That's really cool. It's just kind of a short little instrumental to get the mood going. Then it goes into bam, Wrathchild with a cool bass. Oh man, the bass is awesome. That song kicks in and Paul's screaming and he sounds badass. And Wrathchild, it's so catchy, such a catchy song. And this is the kind of song that I know he's done it live and I heard it. To me, Bruce Dickinson just doesn't work for me with him singing it as much. To me, this is the type of song that's kind of a straight up from the street kind of bad boy metal song. And that's the kind of song that Paul Di'Anno needs to be singing. And man, he nails it. Then you got Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is based on the Edgar Allan Poe story. And this kind of foreshadows a little more the kind of sound and songs they would do later. But it's a great song, man. It kicks ass. It kicks major ass. Another Life. Woo! One of my favorite songs on the album. Great dual guitar work, with Murray and Smith. And man, it's kills. I love the melodies. And God, the way that these guitar lines go, but yet it's still kick ass and fast and from the street. It's amazing. Can't say enough good things about that song. There's the really cool instrumental, Genghis Khan, which to me is, even though I like Transylvania, Genghis Khan is a much better instrumental. So it just shows their evolution. Innocent Exile. Man, this was a song that wasn't like one of the standouts for me when I was younger listening to this, but now it's like one of my favorite songs. It's really cool. It starts off that bass. It's really, really cool bass line, and it kicks in the song. Really interesting song. And again, not quite like a song you would hear them play again. very unique sounding song. A little progressive, but still ballsy and tough. Then you got the title track, Killers. Whoa, oh man, Killers. What a great song. It starts off, with the bass and the guitars. It's a little soft. It's kind of building up, and then it kicks in really heavy. The guitars has that cool effect on it. And Paul is screaming and singing his head off. He sounds so tough and so badass. And again, this is the type of song that, to me, I can't really picture Bruce Dickinson doing it. I know there's stuff that he could do that Paul couldn't do, but this is the type of song that Paul Di'Anno is perfect for, and just brings that tough guy attitude to it. And then this might surprise some people. The next song, Prodigal Son. Prodigal Son is my very favorite Iron Maiden song. That's right, my favorite song. And this song is like nothing they've ever recorded. This song is like nothing they recorded before, and nothing like they will ever record again. There's a little bit maybe of a Rush influence, which I sometimes hear, and obviously as a bassist, I'm sure Steve Harris loved Rush. But I guess it's a ballad, kind of. I mean, it's soft. It's like a slower song, and it's not too heavy. But I wouldn't, in the same way I said this about Aerosmith's Seasons of Wither, which is my favorite Aerosmith song. So this is the type of song that really resonates with me, and I kind of think of this as Iron Maiden Seasons of Wither. It's a song, it's slow, and I guess you can say it's a ballad, but it's also kind of hard rocking in spots, and it's seamless, but it's also a little trippy. It's got a little atmosphere to it, and there's just a magic to the song. That's all I can say. You listen to the song, and you just want to kind of live in it, There's something beautiful about it, and wistful. And again, if Bruce Dickinson sang this song, it wouldn't be the same song. It just wouldn't have it. Paul, just sings it with a lot of emotion, and it's like an emotion that you can connect with, and it's a masterpiece. There's just something. The band would never just do something this off the cuff and seamless and emotional, I think, ever again. I don't think the band, even though I do love them, and I do love those, especially those first 3 albums they did at Bruce Dickinson, kick ass. They're metal classics. But there's not a song that moves me in the way that this song does. And this is the kind of thing that they did with Paul Di'Anno that they wouldn't do afterwards. To me, in some ways they expanded and became more progressive, but in other ways they kind of limited themselves a little bit. And this is an example of a kind of song they would do then that they would limit themselves and not do later. But I love this song. I just can't. I can talk all night about this song. And then we have is Twilight Zone? Oh, that's after. Is that after Purgatory? See, this is the thing. I have both the vinyl version, which is the UK release essentially, so it doesn't have Twilight Zone. And then I also have a version, which was the CD version, which I burned on my computer, which does have the Twilight Zone. But I always kind of forget what or where they put Twilight Zone. And I think in the original release, yeah, that's what confused me. Apparently, originally they put Twilight Zone in America after Killers, but that's not the version I have. I have the remastered version, which put it after Purgatory. So Purgatory is next. Purgatory. Whoa! This is probably my second favorite Iron Maiden song. Man, does this song cook. And so catchy. That chorus, this is another song. It was a single, but it's probably too heavy to cross over outside the metal community. But man, is it catchy. With the Take Me Away chorus of Paul's, and it's just so immediate. I think this is kind of the album's Running Free. Running Free was a really catchy anthem, and this song is really catchy. And badass, and the guitar work and everything. The band's on fire here. You can't. To me, if I actually, even though Prodigal Son is my favorite Iron Maiden song, if I was to play a person one Iron Maiden song and said, this is Iron Maiden at its best, I'd say it was Purgatory. I think Purgatory just is them at their best. Musically, they're on fire. Melodically, they're on fire. Attitude, they're on fire. Everything's on fire. It's an inferno. An inferno of awesomeness. And then they got Twilight Zone, great single, which is on the US version, but not the UK version. That's why I prefer the US version, because why wouldn't you want an extra awesome song? And then it ends with Drifter, which is a really cool song. Another song kind of like Innocent Exile, that that's grown on me a lot over the years. Yeah, I used to think it was kind of an underwhelming conclusion, but now I don't. Now I think it kind of ends it perfectly, and actually it sounds a little like a finale at the end. And it's a great way to end this album. This album, which is a masterpiece and my favorite Iron Maiden album. It's also, I want to also talk about the album cover, because the album cover, if you notice on the first album cover, Eddie looked a little wonky. You know, he looks almost a little silly. It's cool. I like it. It looks like a B-rate 80s horror, like zombie movie thing. But the way that we think of Eddie, like the truly iconic Eddie, is really he first appears on Killers. This is when Derek Riggs really like took his time, knowing that Eddie was going to be a thing, and really drew him to perfection. And just look at that. That's so badass. And he like killed this person. It's like, you know, that's the kind of thing that when I was like in junior high and not quite cool enough yet to get into metal, I was just like into hard rock. I would like see this patch and it would look scary. And Iron Maiden they're not really as scary as that cover looks, but it's badass, you know, and it's from the street and it's tough. And this was sadly the last album of Paul Di'Anno. Now they did do a live EP, Made in Japan, obvious homage to Deep Purple's Made in Japan, but with the pun, Made in Japan. And this was only, I believe, released in Japan and initially as an EP, I think 4 songs, and then there was like a 5-song or 6-song. I don't know the exact songs. I don't have this album. I've listened to it a few times on YouTube. It's very rare and it's not available. I believe there was a version that was put on CD that came out with a version of Killers in the mid-90s, but I didn't have that version. So I never got this. So I don't own this album, but I listened to it several times on YouTube. And I wish I had it, but like it goes for like $50-$60. It's a really rare album. And man, Made in Japan, it kicks ass. And this is raw energy. This is the band with Paul Di'Anno at their peak. They sounded great. I think it has some live recordings from the first album era, and then some from the Killers era, you know, 80 and 81. And it's great, and it's a great document. Also, it's interesting, when they first did this EP, by the time they were releasing it and were doing the album art for it, they had already decided to kick out Paul Di'Anno because he was struggling. He was doing drugs. He was doing a lot of cocaine. And he was doing a lot of cocaine, he said later, because he was really struggling with touring. Like, you know, he was like this regular guy that was, he was like a cook in restaurants and stuff before he joined the band. And he was good doing all the club stuff. But once they started doing like the world tour, you know, once they started touring around the world and stuff and playing venues, you know, and opening up for big bands and stuff, he found that it was really tough on him. You know, some people adapt to that lifestyle and others, you know, don't. And Paul was one of those guys that just really struggled with adapting to that the constant touring. So as a result, he started doing more and more drugs, and he got fucked up. And that's one of the reasons, although I have theories about other reasons, but that's one of the reasons he was kicked out of the band. So the band does this thing, which is kind of mean-spirited, I gotta say, especially since this guy's like struggling with drug addiction and like, you know, not dealing with touring too well. The first cover of this EP shows Eddie actually holding, as you can see there, right there, holding what looks like Paul Di'Anno's severed head. So there's Paul Di'Anno's head, and Eddie's holding it like he, you know, chopped it off. And they showed it, and the band's manager freaked out. Was like, no, you can't do that. And I agree with the manager. It's in bad taste. It's not nice. But I guess they just saw this cheeky, dark humor. But there were some copies that got through before the manager put the hammer to it. I think they were in South America. There was like a few copies. And they are very rare. They go for like hundreds of dollars if you have a copy that has that original cover. But then they replaced it with just a less offensive Eddie just with this samurai sword, which is still cool. But I don't know. It's, even though I think it's in bad taste and I think it's kind of mean towards Paul Di'Anno, it is kind of a cool looking cover. I kind of prefer the one with the severed head. And, you know, in 1982, they did their landmark album, Number of the Beast, with Bruce Dickinson. And that's a great album. I love that album. And it still has a little... That's one of the few Bruce Dickinson albums. There's this and one other I say has a kind of some of the spirit of the new wave of British heavy metal. I wouldn't consider this a new wave of British heavy metal album for the most part. This to me is like more of an international heavy metal album. Like it's not just, you know, from the streets of London anymore. But because you got Clive Burr still playing drums, and this is the last time Clive Burr would be in the band. To me, Clive and Paul are the two elements that most connect Iron Maiden to the new wave of British heavy metal, in terms of spirit and in terms of their performances. And Clive still is bringing that, especially in a song like Gangland. Gangland sounds like, to me, that sounds like a song that Paul Di'Anno could sing. And there's a few songs. There's some songs that sound like Bruce Dickinson tunes, and there's some songs that sound like songs that could have been maybe Paul Di'Anno songs that Bruce Dickinson is singing. Gangland is one of them, and I say Invaders. But this is kind of the end of an era. It's the transition from them being one band to another kind of band. As a little footnote, I'd say the first Iron Maiden album I ever bought, No Prayer for Dying, that's a very undervalued album, and it's grown a lot on me over the years. A lot of fans don't like it. A lot of fans, especially the fans that prefer their progressive side, this they saw as very regressive and going backwards. But to me, I really liked the fact that No Prayer for the Dying was going back to more of a new wave of British heavy metal sound. Now, they didn't quite capture the fire of those albums, and the musicianship's not on that level, nor the songwriting, in my opinion. But still, it's a solid album, and they never again really afterwards ever would kind of sound like the earlier albums again. This is the last time you hear the band kind of sounding like a band that came out of the new wave of British heavy metal. And even the album artwork kind of evokes that. And I really like this album a lot, and I think it's an underrated album. And after the first 5 albums, I actually think this is my 6th favorite Iron Maiden album. So there you go. So if you really like their first 2 or 3 albums, check, and you haven't listened to this album in a while, check out No Prayer for the Dying. To me, it has the spirit of the new wave of British heavy metal, and it's definitely my favorite album of theirs after Power Slave. So there you go. So anyway, Iron Maiden, they became a big, really huge band, T-shirts, the whole thing, and they're great. They're metal legends, but to me, my favorite period is and will always be now. It pretty much hasn't changed in the past few years, the Paul Di'Anno stuff. And to me, you gotta check these albums out if you haven't, and especially Killers. Killers is one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time, period. So, and I just want to say one last thing. Tonight happens to be, and I was planning to do this video anyway, and I didn't know until this morning, it's Paul Di'Anno's birthday. So there you go. Happy birthday, Paul. And I think you're awesome. I think you were one of the best metal singers ever. And I wouldn't mind hearing a whole bunch of Iron Maiden albums with you. But hey, I'll take just the 2 you did, because those 2 albums, they rock, man. And they are awesome. And you're awesome. And you're awesome too. The people listening to this and watching this or whatever you're doing. I'm getting drunk. So I'm wrapping up. Later.